Thanks, Robert. We'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully that was enough Helix for you while you were waiting. See a lot of friendly and familiar faces in the room, but if I don't know you, my name is Nick Wesselman. I'm the Technical Product Manager for Developer Experience at Sitecore. And this means that tools like Rocks are my responsibility, the Helix documentation and practices, as well as the examples of that, including Habitat, not Habitat Home, as we'll talk about. In general, it's my responsibility to look out across the product for general developer experience, API usability, ability for you to unit test things, and so on. But today, my goal is to give you some insight into the ways we're looking to evolve Sitecore Helix and the reasons why. So we have a fairly simple agenda. We're going to do a quick recap of Helix, the why, do some recall on why Sitecore has Helix and what the Helix practices are. We're going to talk about some community feedback we've been gathering on Helix, and finally, how things are evolving. So I have heard the question a few times, why does Sitecore have Helix? Why is Sitecore, as a software vendor, wading into solution architecture? And why is Helix needed for something that's just a CMS? But you all know, as Sitecore developers, that Sitecore is obviously a lot more than just a CMS. It is a platform. It's a very flexible platform that you can use to implement your customer requirements. And there's a lot, and it's even as a CMS, it's really robust. We have a very robust template model with a rich inheritance model to it, and the Sitecore layout model itself is really robust. So we have layouts, we have renderings, and we have interrelations with those templates. So even the data model itself that you as developers control is really robust. And then you also, as developers, have the ability to customize a lot of things, right? It's a very open platform, so you're creating pipeline processors, event handlers, you're taking advantage of the provider model, dependency injection, and you're not only using that to implement customer requirements, but also business logic, but also to do integrations with potentially other complex systems. And we're doing all that in context of an environment that's multi-site and potentially, I guess we can call it multi-tenant within a particular customer. So, and you're trying to orchestrate all this code, a very complex solution within essentially a single Sitecore instance. So it needs to be thought through. And if it's not thought through, you end up with something like this, which is a monolith where you can't distinguish one piece of functionality from another, one piece of code from another. We can't change anything because we don't know where anything is. Or maybe you try to modularize things a bit, but you don't think about the dependencies between those modules. And so maybe you're able to find things, but when you change them, you don't know what effect it's going to have. Because you don't know, you don't see the full dependency structure, and you end up with this sort of mess. So ultimately, what this means for Sitecore customers is that over time, their solution gets to a point of complexity where they're unable to change, unable to add features because the costs are too high. Because you're spending too much time worrying about how things are interrelated, worrying about how, when something changes, what the effect will be, because you're dealing with a flying spaghetti monster. But this problem actually isn't really specific to Sitecore. It's a symptom of any complex software system, and there are kind of solutions, known solutions, and generally accepted development practices to solve this. And they revolve around modular architecture and what we call architected coupling. So we not only want to modularize our code, we want to control the dependencies within the code and control the flow of those dependencies in a way that makes the system easy to understand and more stable, and ultimately leading to more maintainable software and lower cost of ownership for customers. So some might call these modules packages. It's pretty common in Sitecore because package is a loaded term. We call them modules. If you're Alex Shiba, you might call them micro projects. I promise that's the only inside joke in my presentation. So when it comes to modular architecture, a guy named Robert C. Martin, or Uncle Bob, is kind of the known authority. Many of you may be familiar with his book, Agile Principles, Patterns and Practices in C#. Get the P's in the right order. And in that book, he lays out 6 principles for modular architecture or package design, which ultimately give you that architected coupling, more maintainable software, lower cost of ownership. I'm not going to go into these in detail right now, but we'll talk more about the principles behind Helix and the importance of them as we go here. But so ultimately, Helix itself are practices that try to implement those principles. So with Helix, we've created a set of practices and conventions that we believe are optimized for the typical needs of a Sitecore implementation. So if you apply these well, you get the modular architecture and ultimately a more maintainable Sitecore implementation and happier customers. Hopefully these are already familiar to you. We have the concrete features, which are potentially utilizing abstract foundation modules, then composed into modules within the project layer. And then we have rules for the dependencies between those in particular, that we don't want to have feature modules directly referencing other feature modules. And all these rules are, again, there to get you to the goals of following those core principles. So in other words, biscotti bad, ravioli good. So along the way, by following these practices and conventions, we also get a common language and a common solution structure. So that as Sitecore developers, if I pick up someone else's work, we're able to easily digest what's there and understand the solution architecture, and again, more easily maintain it and become productive with that code. And ultimately, once again, reducing cost for customers and increasing the value of their implementation. So, and we provide for you some examples of what a Helix solution could look like. Habitat was the first of those and actually predated Helix, and now I like to call it original Habitat or Habitat Classic. But we also have Habitat Home, whose primary purpose is actually a marketing and sales demo that shows the full functionality of the platform. But we aren't going to put out a sample for you that doesn't follow the Helix practices. So Habitat is also Habitat Home is also a good reference for how to implement Helix. So just to summarize, we have the principles of package design, so the core principles that tell us why. We have the Helix conventions themselves, which tell us how, give us that common language. And we have our examples as guidelines to show us how to implement those conventions. And so the result is supposed to be ultimately that lower cost of ownership for Sitecore customers, and really happier Sitecore developers too, because you're spending your time adding value for customers, implementing cool stuff, rather than spending your time knocking out bugs and worrying about the coupling between those modules. So the question is, this is why Sitecore created Helix, and this is what it is. So is it working? So about a year ago, I took on this product management role for developer experience, and one of my goals was to listen to the community about how Helix is being applied, where it's working, and where it can be improved. So I tried to talk to as many partners and developers as I could, and certainly heard an opinion or two on the Helix Slack channel. And as well, we formed within Sitecore what we call the Helix Working Group. And big thanks to Derek Correa from our technical account manager at Sitecore, who really championed this, and as well as other folks within Sitecore and within the MVP community who participated. We'll be talking more about the Helix working group. It started small. We're going to open it up a bit. But the idea was to have not just one guy, but a group of people within and without Sitecore who are helping kind of shape the Helix practices going forward. In addition, we wanted some insight into the larger community's opinion and use of Helix, as well as the Sitecore developer experience in general. So last year, we put out the first ever Sitecore developer experience survey, and we got over 1,400 responses, which I thought was pretty impressive. Who responded to the developer experience survey? Oh, so we got some room to improve this year. That's great. So this is something we're going to try to do every year, so keep an eye out for that, probably again in the July or August timeframe, and we'd love to see that number go up in 2019. So one of the questions, very simple questions we asked was how many people are applying Helix, and how often are you applying it? And so I thought 66% was a good number, certainly with some room for improvement of folks who are utilizing Helix on their projects. But what was more interesting to me was correlating that to the measures of developer satisfaction that we used. So we used a tool called Net Promoter Score. I won't go into the details of it, but it's basically a measurement of your satisfaction with a particular brand or product. And correlating use of Helix to that satisfaction, to that NPS score, we found that especially among folks who are newer to the platform, you are actually much happier as a Sitecore developer if you're utilizing Helix. And to me, this says that you're spending your time, again, adding value for customers and developing cool stuff, not spending your time on coupling modules, killing bugs, expensive upgrades, and so on. But let's look at, dive into some more of the detailed feedback on Helix, starting with some of the more positive end of things. So folks saying that Helix and SXA making their life better as a Sitecore developer, so maybe, again, allowing you to focus on the things that really matter. One point of feedback here that Helix is the best thing to come out of Sitecore in recent times. I think that was a compliment. A lot of feedback that by using Helix, it improves your ability to upgrade Sitecore solutions. So certainly, if it's clear, if your code is modular and you can make changes when they're more easily make changes when they're breaking API changes, or just having everything isolated into config patches as you would with a Helix solution, all those things are going to make your upgrades at least easier. And this is probably my favorite, from a dev manager or architect, just commenting that it's helped their developers think more about maintainability in general. And again, this gets back to the why of Helix, right? This gets back to making things easier to maintain and being able to lower that cost of ownership, increase the solution value for Sitecore customers. So, obviously not all positive, and so I'm going to go through some points of feedback that we heard from the community here. I think some are maybe are based on misconceptions about Helix and its intentions, so I'll try to address some of those as we go as well. So some people provided feedback around Helix as a rule book, and whether it's okay to deviate from what's within Helix. And here I'll go back to something that I think Thomas Elblum was reiterated a lot, and that's that Helix isn't necessarily best practices. Helix are recommended practices. And the difference there is that the recommended practices might change based on your customer requirements, might change based on your particular solution and what's best for your customer. So I encourage you to remember the why, remember the core principles and the goals of those core principles. If you have to deviate from a particular Helix practice, that's okay if you're remembering those core principles, if you're thinking about the maintainability of your solution. And those core principles are great, but they themselves can maybe be a little inaccessible at times. So from the principles of package design, Uncle Bob says combine SAP and SIDIP amount to DIP for components. And I don't know about you guys, but that hits me right here. I really feel that. It's almost as good as instability equals CE over CA plus CE. I mean, that you guys feel that, right? So, but kidding aside, I mean, it's great content, and if you want to geek out on it, I totally get it. But for the average dark matter developer who just wants to understand the principles and how they apply to their work every day, it can be hard to digest. So I think it would be great if Helix maybe reflected better or had more accessible explanations of these principles and how they apply to Sitecore development. So I've maybe heard once or twice about the number of Visual Studio projects in a Helix solution, and comments like, hey, I'm fighting my tooling in order to not compromise the architecture. And I guess my first point of feedback when I hear this is make sure your modules aren't too granular. I mean, I see some solutions where people are putting single components into a module or trying to take atomic design and adapt it into Helix modules. And the result is that when I do need to make a change, when I do need to update something based on a customer requirement, I'm maybe touching 3 or 4 different modules, which to me, going back to the core principles, things that change together should live together and should be in a single module. So make sure that you are actually building your modules based on business domain, based on your customer requirements and things that change. And you'll maybe find that naturally is going to decrease the number of projects in your solution. I'll add too that if you're using the Habitat gulp scripts out of the box, you may find that itself is slowing down your build times. So some changes to those build scripts can decrease your build times. As well, a lot of people in the community are moving towards MS Build for doing Helix builds, whether it be custom MS Build or Richard Zale's Helix publishing pipeline, and that too can help with your build times as well. We'll talk more about that later. But I do want to recognize the fact that there are folks out there that I think are successfully applying Helix with fewer Visual Studio projects, using tools like FXCop to sort of create logical boundaries between modules instead of physical boundaries. And I think if you understand the impact of that and understand that you're maybe violating common closure a bit, which is to say that you're spreading the assets of a module around the solution, as long as you understand the impact of that, then maybe Helix itself should recognize that as an option in structuring your solution. So another quick one that I hear sometimes is, how do I apply Helix? I'm following an agile methodology. And the answer is, well, Helix is an agile methodology. So if you are trying to design all your modules up front, you're probably opening yourself up for failure just as much as if you weren't really trying to architect those modules. And the reason is you don't really know how to encapsulate that code into packages, into modules, until you're in it, until you understand the requirements, understand the integrations, and are able to then add that, find the right place in your solution for that module and create it then. So if you're doing sort of big design up front with Helix, I encourage you to back away from that and evolve your Helix architecture as your solution is built. Then we get into a lot of feedback about how to handle feature-to-feature communication and scoping of modules and so on. So maybe some feedback around analysis paralysis. Do I put this new class into an existing module or create a new one? What layer do I put this module in? Is it project, feature, or foundation? And sometimes having some regrets later about where you put that module. And I think all this kind of speaks to, and actually, frankly, this is probably the biggest source of questions in the Helix channel on Slack too. I need to do this thing. What layer does it go in? How do I encapsulate this into a Helix module? And I think this really speaks to the need for more recipes, more patterns, more sort of case studies in the Helix documentation that speaks to particular scenarios and what to and how to handle them. And you maybe have just a little bit of feedback about Habitat too, and how it's used. So Habitat itself has been the workhorse of Helix for a while. But folks, lots of feedback around the use of gulp, maybe some aspects of Habitat that need some significant updates, and obviously the use of it as a starter kit gets pointed out a lot. But I kind of understand, right? Because it's the example of how to implement Helix. Helix requires customizations to your build process. And so, and as well as at least as it's shown in Habitat, it requires customizations to the core platform. So what's the easiest way to get all that stuff? Copy Habitat. Not saying it's right, but just saying I understand. But really, it's just one approach too. What if I want to use TDS instead of Unicorn? According to the Sitecore Developer Survey, that's 60% of you. So how do we better show how to use how to apply Helix with other tool sets? As well as Habitat's just a single site. It technically shows how to you would add another project, but there's a multitude of multi-site requirements out there that range from sort of franchise models to sites that want to share back-end code but not front-end code. So Habitat is kind of lax in that area too. So to me, this speaks to needing more better examples of applying Helix. And finally, lots of feedback about training your teams on Helix. The documentation is obviously a lot to digest. Sitecore offers the workshop, but that either requires bringing a trainer on site or sending your developers elsewhere, which can be time-consuming and potentially expensive. So we need better ways of helping you guys learn Helix too. I totally agree. So yeah, some misunderstandings there, but lots of great feedback. Let's talk about what we're going to do about it and how Helix needs to evolve. So first off, I want to address that last point of feedback right away and say that coming in June, Sitecore Training Department is going to be offering a Helix Digital Classroom. Obviously, just learning Helix and going through a workshop going through an online workshop isn't enough to really understand and apply it perfectly, but it's a way to help your teams get more familiar with Helix and the practices quickly. So watch for that coming in June. But with regard to the Helix documentation itself and how we continue to evolve that based on all your feedback, the first point is that we're going to keep involving you, and we want to make this an open process. So late last year, we put out about 10 requests for comments as GitHub issues on the Helix docs repository. How many commented on those, or at least gave a thumbs up or thumbs down on some of those? Okay, we've got a few in the room. Thank you all for your feedback. And the idea here was to give more input to the Helix working group to help prioritize what some of the changes should be. And so based on all of that feedback, I'll go through what some of our priorities are going to be, some of the changes you should see to Helix probably in the next couple months. And first, if it wasn't obvious from my continuing discussion of the why, it is more focused on those core principles that inspired Helix. Those core principles that are supposed to give you more maintainable code and create more value for your customers. But as I alluded to earlier, we want to make these more accessible. I think Martin Davies, Martin, are you in the room? No, not here. Did a great blog post on explaining the core principles in Sitecore terms and in Helix terms. So that's the kind of content that we'll be looking to add to the Helix documentation itself. And yes, we hear you. If you want to use fewer projects and you understand the impact of that, and you use tooling like FXCOP to help enforce those logical boundaries, I think the Helix documentation should discuss that and obviously with the impact of it, but should present it as an option for you, especially I think for smaller solutions. And TDS is mentioned in the Helix documentation, but I think it should be, we need to expand on that a bit and talk about what solution structures could look like when making use of TDS. So, and I think since Helix was released, Sitecore has introduced, I don't know what it's up to now, 3 or 4 additional services that you might deploy to as part of your Sitecore implementation. So we need to update the guidance on solution structure to reflect that. In particular, it's not just code anymore. It's website, it's commerce, it's XConnect, and potentially other deployment targets as well. So, and these are the things that we're trying to get out and release by June, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to continue to incorporate your feedback as well as Sitecore kind of strategic goals. So JSS in particular, we're still kind of, it's obviously very new, and we're still kind of gathering best practices on its implementation, but in the end, it's like any other software. It needs modular architecture. Whether in a particular JSS app you require your front-end developers to have feature and foundation layers, I think is a bigger question, but modular architecture certainly, and your Sitecore artifacts, I think will probably you'll still want to follow the Helix conventions. More multi-site discussion. There's a lot of range to multi-site, and I think we need to address those scenarios in more detail. And then getting into those recipes, those how-tos, and even some anti-patterns, and again, as Martin Davies calls them, Helix smells, I think would be great, so that you can know not just when you're doing the right thing, but when you're doing the wrong thing. So it became very apparent in talking about all this that we need some additional examples. We need to revamp the examples as well to go with some of these changes. And so the presentation title here is a bit misleading because we're actually, what we're talking about is probably saying bye-bye to Habitat and hello to Helix Examples. And so the idea here is to have actually multiple examples of Helix, of following Helix practices that are developer focused, and by that I mean the intention is for them to not be marketing demos. I'm sure at some point some SE or salesperson will use them, but it is that there's simple functionality with very basic design, so that you can, as a developer, you're focusing on the code, not on the functionality of the site. Well, we want to show multiple approaches to multi-site, different multi-site scenarios. We want to try to minimize the platform customization that's in these and try and show as much as possible how to implement Helix without extending Sitecore. And along the way, we want to leverage and showcase all the great community tooling that's been created around Helix. So just quickly go through the examples as we have them planned. The first is what I call basic company. And the examples overall are going to be simple. This one is going to be even simpler because we want to use it to show basically implementing the same solution with multiple tool sets, multiple approaches. So could have a unicorn-based example, could have a TDS-based example, may even show an example with a more consolidated project structure and FXCOP. Example 2, I'm calling franchise multi-site. The idea here is to have a multi-site scenario where you have shared back-end and front-end code, maybe a little more idealistic multi-site scenario, if you will. With just some maybe CSS skinning on the front end and perhaps varying workflow across the sites. The third example, probably more realistic, which is what I'm calling corporate multi-site. So we maybe have very divergent front ends, maybe trying to share some back-end code, trying to share some features and foundation modules, but with differing markup. So probably with the use of MVC areas or another approach to differing site front ends. This will probably also be the most complex of the examples, showing more Helix patterns, feature-to-feature communication, and so on. And as I mentioned, along the way, we want to leverage community tooling and showcase the community's contributions to Helix. So likely making, right now, as this is starting development, we're making use of Richard Zale's Helix publishing pipeline to enable MS Build-based Helix architecture, or MS Build-based Helix builds, if you will, and as well, Anders Runaway. We're using his Helix templating system here with some custom templates that make use of package reference and so on to kind of give you those so that we have a consistent structure across our Helix modules. And even though Helix Publishing Pipeline can do most of the things that Gulp is currently used for in Habitat, it is still helpful to have a task runner to do things like the initial build and setup of the environment, or to be able to do a build and unicorn deploy with a single command. But instead of using Gulp, we can make use of the task runner that Sitecore already has, and that's Sitecore Install Framework, or SIF. So do things like expanding the installer assets for you with SIF, and using the existing SIF configurations for XP0 combined with some configurations that'll do build and deploy. So I think this will also be a great showcase of how you can integrate SIF into your builds. So what about Habitat? What about Habitat Classic? I think likely we'll retire it and deprecate it as soon as we can replace all the references to it with Helix Examples. So in other words, when Helix Examples is built out enough that we don't need to reference it anymore, we'll deprecate it probably later this year. If you like it, you are more than welcome to fork it. I'd encourage you to look at Habitat Home first to see if it meets your needs. But you do fully have the ability to fork Habitat and keep going with it. Our only requirement is that you have to rename it, because I'm really sick of people coming to me with Habitat Home issues. So again, coming back to our goals. So evolved Helix, better use of modular architecture, and based on better reference examples and more accessible training, increasing the value for Sitecore customers, because that's what it's all about. So you might be saying to yourself, this is a lot of work, Nick, how can I help? And I would say, thank you for asking. So first off, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking to expand the Helix working group. If you are a Sitecore MVP, you might be familiar with the other working groups. So we are looking to get more folks formally involved with that. So look for announcements around that from the MVP program and Tomas Varga. Even if you're not an MVP, going to continue to keep the Helix docs open source and try to facilitate discussion on those through GitHub issues. So if you have a suggestion, if you have more commentary on an RFC, please go to the Helix docs GitHub and discuss there. And of course, the Slack Helix channel is a great place for kind of more open-ended discussion. If you want to contribute, again, we'll accept pull requests on Helix docs as well. And there is going to be a process for those to get approved by the Helix working group. And I hope in the coming weeks to open up work in progress on the Helix examples, as well as to track the full backlog as for those as a GitHub project as well. So if you want to contribute, again, PRs will be more than welcome there. And of course, you're just welcome to keep trolling me on Twitter through hashtag Sitecore Helix memes too. Thank you. How am I doing? How are we doing time?
I think we have some time, right? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? If there are any questions?
Okay. We work with a big project, and then we realized that the habitat was the way to go, so we had to copy everything and rename. But once in a while, we need to create new projects. And in that sense, we created our own Visual Studio template to copy, paste, and replace everything. Do you have plans to create a Visual Studio template in order to go there just new Helix solution out of the box, clean, without copying, pasting examples?
Yeah, I'd say in the, I guess maybe the longer term Sitecore roadmap, we might create our own, but at this point, I'm trying to support existing community solutions for that. So Anders Laub has an existing extension that I think I showed earlier that allows you to template various types of Helix modules, feature foundation project, and even stub out the unicorn items and so on as well. So I think that'd be a place to look if you want something that's more kind of supported by the community.
I know that it's really out there on the fringe.
Yeah.
I would like to see guidance for CI deployments.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, because the idea now with pipelines we can do YAML for the pipelines. If Helix went to YAML, went to pipelines, it would help a lot of people understand how to do CI properly. From that standpoint. Yeah,
absolutely. And I don't think it was on the list, but one of those RFCs is specifically around DevOps. So I think expanding the existing DevOps documentation in Helix is certainly on our radar. And with the new examples, maybe we should put them in Azure pipelines. Right. Oh, sorry, I'll let these guys handle mics.
Hi, one of the contributors to your RFCs earlier.
Thank you.
My question is, in terms of the Sitecore buy-in for Helix, there's still some pinch points in Sitecore Implementation which are blockers in some cases for Helix adoption, like, for example, source fields and template inheritance detection within queries and things like that.
Absolutely.
Is that being fed back into the product streams within Sitecore?
Absolutely. So it's something I didn't mention here in interest of time, but that's been one of my goals as well, is trying to reduce those blockers within the product. So the initial work on that was just getting the Helix folders into the product and adding a descends from method on item and I think the all templates field, doing deep template indexing. But the source field issues and the Sitecore queries support for template inheritance are on my radar as well, and I'm pushing as hard as I can to get those done by the core product team. Good question.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is Sitecore recommending Helix as the architect for all Sitecore projects in future, or?
Yeah, I think absolutely. As far as your solution architecture within Visual Studio, I think that's always the place you should start. If you and even for commerce projects, we want to provide, like I said, we want to provide more guidance around that and how you would structure a commerce project for Helix.
What about very small, simple, straightforward Sitecore projects?
So I think even in those cases, that's one of the reasons we want to show those sort of alternate solution structures, because if you need to do a quick implementation and you understand the impact of kind of flexing on some of those Helix rules or Helix prac conventions, I think you should still be using Helix as a starting point. Like I said, it's not a rule book, so if you understand the impact and you have a smaller solution that you need to develop in a more, I guess, sort of bad term here, but agile manner, then go for it. But I'd still, even if you're going to do a project per layer, which I think that's maybe taking it a little too far, at least make use of something like the FX cop rules from Hedgehog to help enforce those module boundaries.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What's the future of Habitat Home?
So the question was, what's the future of Habitat Home? And the answer is ask technical marketing. But no. The answer is it's going to have a robust future, I'm sure. Habitat Home is meant to be a demonstration of the full capabilities of the platform while also being a sales and marketing demo. So Habitat previously kind of had this dual role of being a sales demo and your developer reference, and we're kind of trying to separate those. But it's still, Habitat Home is a great demo site. It's going to continue to be a great reference for how to implement Helix and what the platform product looks like when fully implemented. But as far as being a developer reference, I think it's just too big. So we're trying to make the Helix examples more targeted.
So I think that Habitat has changed and can keep changing Sitecore. Make Sitecore do things differently. And I was wondering what's your opinion on async programming? Because like controller renderings can't do it.
Yeah.
You know, some of the Habitats got it, but not all of it. But a lot of when you look at Sitecore and ILSpy, it's all async.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
When you look at the newer pieces, for sure, but you look at Sitecore Data Provider, and that's where that's not async, and that's async. If you go async, it's async all the way down, kind of like turtles. But the problem is that to do async controller renderings, we need async data access, and that's the goal. But I don't think we need Habitat to drive that.
Okay.
One more question. That's going to be the final one.
I'm very happy about the talk of it not being a rule book, because I think that there is big conception that it actually is, also in some of the formulations. But I'm going to ask you, are going to have the same talk internally in Sitecore with sales, professional services, and other people, reviewers of solutions and things like this?
Yeah, that's yes.
Thank you. Mostly because you said there was a lot of misunderstandings.
Yeah.
I actually think most of them are driven from within Sitecore.
If they're giving you trouble, send them my way.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, if you have other questions, please come find me. I want to know about your experience as Sitecore developers so I can help make it better.